Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's Xtalks webinar. Today's talk is entitled, Can Increased Data Access Improve Patient Enrollment and Engagement? My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your Xtalks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, please contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Eligo Health Research, who developed the content for this presentation. Eligo Health Research, a healthcare enabling research organization powered by their Intelligo research stack technology, uses electronic health records and the trusted patient and physician relationship to ensure that all patients have access to clinical research as a care option. They directly engage physicians and patients who otherwise would not participate in clinical research and accelerate the development of new pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device and diagnostics products. You can learn more at eligodirect.com. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Faith Holmes, MD, brings more than 30 years of experience in direct patient care and 11 years of medical practice management to her role as Eligo's medical director and vice president of medical affairs. Her unique perspective plays an important part in building the company's network of research-ready physician practices and preparing them to conduct research. Holmes provides medical scientific expertise to support future growth and strategy and functions as central principal investigator and decentralized clinical trials. Michael Ibarra has more than 20 years of experience in clinical research and development. Throughout his career, Ibarra has sought to improve healthcare by bringing together healthcare data and digital technologies. His interests include regulatory and policy implications for digital healthcare, exploring the factors needed to allow interoperability of healthcare data for all stakeholders involved, and implications for the use of big data, machine learning, and natural language processing to improve their ability to perform regulated clinical research. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our first speaker, Faith Holmes. You may begin when you're ready.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today. So let's get right into that first slide. So we're all very familiar with the statistics around the fact that 55% of trials globally are terminated due to low accrual rates, and more than 80% fail to enroll, resulting in either study extension timelines or additional sites being added. And this all has an ethical as well as a financial and scientific consequences. So this is something we're all very much aware of. I want to start off by taking a poll right now.
Yes, so we have a poll question for audience members to interact with in real time. This should be appearing on your screen now, and you can vote on this question by clicking on as many of the answers as apply to you and then clicking submit. The question that we have for you is, have you encountered any of the following challenges to enrollment and engagement for your research trials? Your answer options are designing truly patient-centric protocols, locating diverse and difficult to reach patients, strengthening the physician and patient relationship, creating real-world compatible trial designs, or expanding inclusion criteria. Again, the question is, have you encountered any of these following challenges to enrollment and engagement for your research trials? And you can select more than one answer and then click submit for us. We'll keep this going for a few more seconds. We appreciate everyone taking the opportunity to consider how this applies to yourself or your company and provide us with an answer. It looks like most of you have voted, so let's go ahead and take a look at those results. Coming in at 100%, the locating diverse and difficult to reach patients. Also 100% of you have chosen creating real-world compatible trial designs. 67% of you have chosen expanded inclusion criteria. 50% for designing truly patient-centric protocols. And then 30% of the answers went to strengthening the physician-patient relationship. Thank you again for your participation. It's greatly appreciated. And Faith, it's back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Ryan. That's really interesting. So we clearly haven't solved the problem at this point. So let's talk about some of the solutions. And one of the things when we're looking at ways to find solutions that I would invite you to think in terms of something that we talk about in healthcare, which is social determinants of health. And so what are those things? Those are things like employment, finances, education, skills, community and social support, housing, family and childhood experience. And if we take those things and juxtapose them to current recruitment efforts and use that as a framework, we can start to look at how can we overcome these barriers. So, because all of those things affect access to healthcare, and equally so, they affect recruitment strategies and access to clinical trials. So in 2019, US Census was a little over 328 million lives. Through partnership with practices, health systems, as well as Cerner, which is, as you know, is one of the largest EHR systems in the US, as well as Harris Computer and its family of EHR platforms, we can have access to over 150 million patient lives via their EMR data. So we're looking at almost half of the US census data lives. So by using that, we can take any given protocol, query across 150 million lives of patients who live in diverse circumstances, geographic areas, who mirror a real world cross-section of the country. When you're looking at that many lives, it organically creates a diversity by finding the practices where the patients are already existing within their current medical home. So let's look at the next slide and see how that works to put the patient at the center of research. So by querying across all of the EHR data by diagnosis and some inclusion exclusion criteria, you can identify where the patients are and what practices they're with. So we start with the patient. Instead of starting with a research center and bringing patients in, we start with the patient and then approach that physician. If you think about that approach to the physician, instead of coming and saying, hey, would you like to be involved in a clinical trial? It's a very different conversation when you can say, we have 64 patients with severe COPD who may be eligible for this specific clinical trial. When physicians hear that kind of thing, it's a very different conversation than just a generic question. And they're not seeing table sets or ones and zeros. They see patient faces. So the data cannot take you so far. Ultimately, it comes to a one-on-one conversation with the patient about entry into any given trial. But it's that data that helps to bridge the gap between the patient, the protocol, and getting them with that physician that they already have that relationship with. That physician relationship is the most effective conduit to getting entry into a clinical trial. One of the ways in which the patient location can inform a trial design is it can incorporate some of the elements. For instance, if the patients are at very diverse or rural locations, and that's identified through the EHR and the data queries, then you can realize that incorporating aspects of virtual visits, technology, or decentralized trials is going to be a much more effective way to actually reach the patient. And you get there by, again, leading with finding the patient and where they are. The other thing that we have found is by having such a robust data set to look into, we can provide some really meaningful protocol feedback that can lead to protocol amendments. A recent example was a trial where we had they were having difficulty enrolling. The patient in providing the feedback that was gained through such a robust data set it resulted in the first week following the amendments, we were able to have more patients scheduled for visit 1 than in the entire previous 9 months of recruitment attempts. So in the next slide, let's look at that, the way in which we can bridge that gap between the patient and their own physician. It was interesting in the poll that the strengthening the physician-patient relationship was lowered. One of the things I would like to challenge you with is that by taking advantage of that existing physician-patient relationship, it can help locate where patients are, find those invisible patients, and bring them to a clinical trial. When you have EHR systems that, such as Cerner, as I mentioned, it's typically across large health centers, hospital systems, and then EHRs such as the Harris brings, such as Amazing Charts, DigiCharts, that organically will give you different types of specialties and give you a real picture of where the patients are. For instance, in a given single query, we can find over 400 patients with Huntington's disease. Or on another query, we can find in more common elements we can find tens of thousands of patients with hyperlipidemia. Identify the practices as well where it may be a geographic area of interest. For instance, those who are seeing patients being treated with Lyme disease. And so we can find those patients where they are and access this untapped patient population. And then one of the things with COVID is it has increased a lot of awareness about clinical trials, and we can leverage that to be able to create more interest. The next slide, I want to circle back to that physician-patient relationship. One of the things that we have seen repeatedly in using this mechanism for accessing patients is by having a patient-centric approach that it respects that existing physician-patient relationship. There's more of a comfort level and openness that often will lead to patients not only being more readily willing to enroll in trials, but we've seen a significant increase in the impact that has on compliance throughout the length of the trial, but also on retention rates within the trials. Many of the physicians who are working with these patients are ones that are embedded within their community, as opposed to being at an academic center and patients having to go to those sites. We can augment those kind of trials by having a physician who is introducing their own patient to the clinical trial, because they're a part of that community, and it increases the patient's willingness. The next slide, I just want to talk about the fact that all of this provides a flexibility and agility to be able to scale studies by being able to access data across all of these data sets, and it results in reduced time that those local study coordinators or study managers will have to be doing chart review. It means they can move on to the next steps of actually calling the patients and can shorten timelines to enrollment. In addition, it creates some efficiencies such that we can create virtual waiting rooms. And then the patients then are in the virtual waiting room with so the time when we can initiate the study for a much faster, more compressed enrollment period. PCORI published some results of a study which talked about the percentage of their investigators and research partners identified 3 domains where there were the most common engagement challenges. One was the infrastructure to support engagement, such as staff, finances, logistical needs. The other 2 were building relationships and maintaining relationships. So if we can provide that infrastructure to the physicians, they already bring to us by our accessing the patient first through the data and engaging their physician, They already have built that relationship and have already been maintaining that relationship to make this a really successful solution. So we've been talking about the world of the one-to-one physician relationship. So I want to turn it over now to somebody who thinks more in the world of ones and zeros, which is Michael's area of expertise. Michael?
Thank you, Faith. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start just by stepping back for a minute and talking about how we got here. We all know that patients are hard to find, and it's possible, people could say, well, they've always been hard to find. But in fact, I think it's pretty clear to anybody operating in the field that it's much more difficult to find them now. Next slide, please. And the question is, what's the situation that we're in now, right? So first of all, I remember years ago now when I was on the pharmaceutical sponsor side, we talked about it looks like there are no more blockbusters. So when you had an antibiotic that had a broad coverage, it wasn't hard to find patients. And as you go away from blockbusters, you get into more specific populations of patients that you're looking for. As the clinical conditions get more complex, that begins to wean down your population as well. And then, of course, we have growing regulations. They rarely go backwards. So you've got more stringent controls, and you've got an attempt to make sure that that drug has enough population so that you can find a statistical difference. So you put these things together, you put together the fact that it continues to be expensive to run a trial anyway, and also the fact that you're trying to sort of split your attention sometimes between how could we use real-world evidence, how can we turn real-world data into real-world evidence, and put together a trial. And as you say, with a spreadsheet, the cells get empty very fast. In other words, there are very few patients theoretically that even match that. So I think that the situation that we're in now is acute, and it's not just the same thing that we've always had. It's actually more difficult because you've got pressures coming from both sides in terms of the type of things you need to satisfy in order to get regulatory approval, and then the fact that the clinical conditions you're after and your testing are more specific, so fewer patients in general have that. So and on top of all that, it's clear then as it goes forward, there's more competition for those same patients as more sponsors are putting out more drugs. And that puts us in a situation now where, okay, patients are hard to find, and great, we can scale. Next slide, please. So an obvious sort of knee-jerk solution to it is that if we scale more patients, then we can find more patients. The question is, how is that situation different than it was before? And I think the key difference now that allows us to actually have a possible solution to this is the digitization of healthcare data. And it's clear that finally, in a sense, data is driving innovation in regulated clinical trials. It's been true in the other industries, in publishing and music and banking. It's finally come into healthcare. And honestly, I think that FDA, although, if you're a dyed in the wool sponsor advocate, you would have been surprised 10 years ago, but FDA probably has driven more innovation in this area than anybody else because they've changed the regs in order to accommodate the changes in healthcare digitization of data. So with the onset of requiring the use of EHRs and the sort of rules that ONC has been putting out with data sharing and the standards that have been evolving there, we now are at the point where we can have the ability to scale data, and it exists. But the question is it enough just to get the numbers? So in other words, we can find very large sources of patient data, as Faith was saying, in EHRs. And in fact, that's what she was alluding to it earlier. Through Eligo, for example, we have our own network. We have a partnership with Cerner to get lives. We have a partnership with Ascension Health. to get lives. We have a partnership with Harris Computers to get lives. And so the question is, well, you have that scale now. Is that enough? Next slide, please. And in fact, we've been talking about this for quite a while, and the short answer is no, it's not enough. And I think that it is completely parallel to the problem that when you look at what happened with electricity, we had electricity around sort of available for 10 to 15 years before you saw increases in productivity. And when you look at the factory floor for a typical production plant using a steam generator, they had a giant cylinder running down the middle of it. Everybody was connected with this giant rubber bands, basically, running the machines. Electricity started to improve productivity when guys realized if we change around the factory floor and remove all that, we can have a little electric motors at every spot. We can change the flow of things. We can put like things together, and you start to see an increase in productivity. And so it's what I call basically just changing the factory floor. Next slide, please. So the idea is that with a wealth of a resource, we need to think about our processes, and we need to think about how things have done up to now, because we designed a lot of our processes based on a scarce resource of patients. What if you're thinking about that you have enough patients now? Some of the problems you run into that you think, oh, I'd love to have the problems, but once you get them, you realize there's still problems that you have to solve. The first one, going back, is how do you get that kind of scale? And in fact, in today's world, whereas 10 years ago, the goal, maybe 5 years ago, even the goal was it was sort of a land grab. How many patients can any one organization or group put together? In fact, now I think it's impossible for any one group to put together enough patients to be able to find particular populations and cohorts that you need. And an example of that is for Eligo. What we're trying to do today, we realize that it's impossible. We're never going to have the 95 million patient lives now that Cerner has, for example. So you need to partner. And there's a whole series of issues that come around partnering with data partners that sometimes have to do with data questions, sometimes have to do with informatics, often have to do with data privacy, often have to do with legal arrangements and things like that, that you need to understand and put in place in order to get the value out of that data. Just putting partners together doesn't do it, because there are operational barriers to accessing the data, using the data, and the EHRs in the past have not been designed to be able to share data for other uses. When you look inside of many EHRs and many other types of companies that handle patients, they're often sort of a conglomerate of very small legal structured arrangements and things. So the last thing you may think about when you're looking at a large set of patients is how many of those can actually flow freely into clinical trials and things like that. So there's a whole effort there to put together partnerships for that. Beyond that, then, it gets into the question of before you were happy to get a few patients in, and you didn't, it was sort of a bespoke system with each site. A site comes on board, you wait for patients to come in, they trickle in, that's great. Now you have a situation where you have a lot of patients, and if you're not specific enough in what you're asking for there, you can be overwhelmed. So you can have, whereas before you may have 100 patients that qualify, running across 150 million patients, you may have 10,000 patients that qualify. And it's impossible to tell using chart review and using people to get down to the group of patients that you're really going to use there. So that calls for the fact that we need to investigate strongly and start piloting the use of, machine learning and other artificial intelligence techniques in order to assist humans there to go through this data. Next slide. So in order to do this, it's a good thing that we have the scale. We need to learn how to partner across data partners in order to get that scale. But the basic conclusion there is it's not a single player game. So that's a different approach to it. Secondly, everybody has heard the phrase interoperability. it's important to understand there's a tremendous number of pitfalls, unfortunately, on the path to interoperability that I was just talking about, for example, anywhere from legal down to data model, for example. And those things, you need to have a conscious strategic approach to that in order to free the value of that data that you're using. And then finally, what you're really trying to do is get to the point where you can find a patient that's most qualified and place that patient into a trial. And that very often means you're going to have to change, if you've got processes that were working in previous models, meeting-oriented processes and manual, you're going to have to change that in order to be able to process through the patients the way you need them to get the value out of it. Next slide. So let's say we are able to do this. What are the areas that we're getting at? What are the benefits that we're getting to? Next slide. As was alluded to before, and people mentioned in the survey, getting the racial, gender, age-based groups represented, getting those patients that you need for either regulatory or scientific purposes into the trial, finding them so you have enough to populate the trial in the right way, that should help because of the scale. And the health equity gaps, as Faith was talking to, the same sort of thing with the scale. Next slide. Feasibility is a pet topic of mine. Feasibility, as anybody knows that's been doing it for a long time in the industry, is a lot of gambling and betting and bragging. And it's usually a heuristic that you use to get general direction of what might be there. In this situation, as you begin to be able to apply more specific searching and machine learning techniques to a very large data set, feasibility starts to become a real projection. And that cuts out a lot of the uncertainty involved, so that when you have 100 times the number of patients initially qualified for a trial, and you're able to, again, change your processes and apply new techniques in order to get more specific about which ones of those really match, now you're getting to an area where you can project that you have real patients for real trials that can be enrolled. And it also allows then a modeling of that. If you can do that, you can model your protocol and look at places where you could be running into trouble ahead of time before you've implemented and then have to do the dreaded amendments and things like that. Next slide. And I think this is the real benefit of being able to work this way, think differently. Real scale this way allows you to change the enrollment process. So as I said, and everybody knows, when you enroll, sites have their own rhythm of enrollment. You get a site on board, and then the site has the advertising materials, and eventually the site recruits the patients. If you're able to find the patients en masse all at once, and you have done the things that I'm talking about with single contracts and clearing the way so that the sites are research ready, as we say, ready to take on the patients for the trial, then you find that tranche of patients, you can start your enrollment process across those sites at the same time, very close to the same time. And so you're enrolling now at a rate that you can't match in the traditional enrollment process, because everybody starts close to the same time and ends much closer. It not only lets you end enrollment sooner, it gives you more control over the process because it's happening at the same time. And it's much more conducive to following metrics to see where you're at and managing the problems and things like that. It doesn't become this sort of ongoing thing where you reach a certain point. It becomes a very targeted solution where you can put a smaller number of resources on it for full time, for example, and then get it done and move on. And I think that is, it will be proven out, I think, over time as we look at this and measure it to be one of the greatest benefits. Once you get the trial rolling that way, then a lot of things fall into place. Next slide. So this is a sort of summary that We're talking about scale, trial success, and enhanced patient care follow from that, as Faith was talking about. More relevant protocols follow from that. Proactive thinking about research as a care option, meaning research as a care option means that we've embedded the research activity more into the healthcare community. So finding those patients in doctors that are not traditionally doing research means that we can return that information back to those same doctors so that the standard of practice could be informed much sooner than going through a typical, journal publication process and things like that. Next slide. This is a summary that increased access, the scale that I've been talking about, supports all stakeholders and streamlines the entire clinical research process. And I think that's the last slide. So I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I'd like to invite our audience to continue sending your questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of the webinar. I have already received some questions though, so we'll get ourselves started with those. Our very first question for you asks if you can expand on how you have access to 150 million lives. That's, of course, almost half the US population.
Yeah, that's an amazing number. It amazed me when we were tallying it. And the answer is what I was talking about before. It's basically partnering. But I can talk about the components of that number. Basically, Elligo Health Research has our own sites and network. We partner with Cerner, who has the lion's share, as I said, 95 million lives. We partner with Harris Computer, and we also partner with Ascension Health. We partner with organizations in Canada as well. And going across those organizations and adding the patient lives in is the number, is how you get to 150 million.
Excellent, thank you very much. Our next question states that increased access doesn't matter if you just multiply the work of reviewing many more patients for a trial. Their question is, how do you improve accuracy if finding patients so that, how do you improve accuracy in finding patients so that the dropout rate decreases?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And that's what I was speaking of as we solve one problem, we get presented with another. And the problem that we have here, Herbert Simon, a Nobel laureate, talked about when information is scarce and you design a system, it's very different than when information is abundant and you often need to design a different system. That's the situation we're in today. And it follows the same, we're following the same trajectory that other fields have followed. We digitize the data, it's much easier to get the patients. And so now we have a whole lot of patients. Like I said, we may have 100 times the number of patients we need. Now that sort of search before, let's say it's an ICD-10 code search, for example, if you're familiar with that, we're searching on diagnosis codes. Before that may have returned 100 patients and you need 100 patients, so you just start looking for them and going through them. 100 is a manageable number by hand in a sense. If you end up with 1,000 and 10,000, you can't put those through the same manual review, chart review process. So what we need to do is we need to embrace computer-assisted technologies. And there's groups all around looking at this stuff. We are implementing our own. One of the things we're doing is with recent acquisition with a company called Root Health, which actually has a chat bot that is reaching out to patients. So if you need to have a conversation with patients at scale, Root Health can do that. You can reach out to 10,000 at the same time. And if you're only needing to find out from them, are you interested in this trial? And it cuts out half of your population. That's a tremendous help. From then on, the great pursuit that I'm involved with daily is finding ways to get better representation of your data, especially time series in the EHR data, so that you can answer more specific questions like needs to have been on a stable regimen for 6 weeks or something like that. Questions you typically aren't able to answer before start doing chart review. So the overall answer is applying computer-assisted techniques and and automated techniques in order to be able to scale the type of manual tasks that we did in the past, I think is the way that we can handle the increase in access to patients.
Excellent, thank you very much. Our next question would like to know, if you are starting with data to find the patient, how do research physicians in particular, naive, respond to being approached about a clinical trial?
Yeah, and I can take that. And so one of the things that Eligo does is we are partnered with many physicians, physician practices who are already engaged in research. And then we're also, through this methodology that Michael's been talking about, we may locate patients in a place where that physician has not had an opportunity to be involved in research, but they may have expressed an interest in doing so. And so oftentimes the initial response is, I'd like to do this, but I don't have that infrastructure. And so one of the things that we do is we bring with not only that offer of the fact that we have found patients in your practice who may be eligible, but also we can bring the infrastructure that includes regulatory contracts and budgeting, project management support, a potential study coordinator, remote support, a decentralized team, so we can bring options to them so that it doesn't have to be an overwhelming or impossible task to be able to offer research to their patients. So particularly for those naive ones, I mentioned earlier about the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute's discussions about the domains of challenges. And so that infrastructure portion is what we can provide, and we can facilitate training so that those local investigators can become investigators by access to getting GCP trained, HSP trained. We provide sets of SOPs and protocols that they can work under and provide that training and the infrastructure. And then in addition, working through decentralized trials. We have an entire decentralized trial team that is able to support a local investigator to be able to bring research to their patients.
Excellent, thank you very much. Our next question states that this seems about using EHR data for clinical research purposes. Their question is if you could please give some examples of success stories, i.e. speeding up clinical trials and the efficiency gained.
I think Faith, you had some initial examples there, and I can follow on.
Yeah, so what the one that I mentioned earlier had to do with finding some rare diseases, and sometimes there are some disease processes where, particularly ones that we don't have a good answers for, there may be an interest at an academic level of engaging with the patients, with the families, but then beyond that, the patients may be in a place where they're not able to go and access that research center. But when we find the patient, maybe at some remote area, then through the EHR data that may not be anywhere near a research center, then that's something that just sort of uncovers the location of that patient. Another specific example was a decentralized trial on a diagnostic screening test. There had been, we completed that 2019, 2020. Other proposals that had been brought to this particular sponsor proposed an enrollment that involved 1,400 patients, and it was proposed that that be done over about a year's period of time. Through a decentralized model, we were able to enroll those patients in about a four-month period of time. Another example had to do with being able to pre-identify patients, set them up in that virtual waiting room, and then green light all of the sites at the same time to get a speedier enrollment. I'll turn it over to you, Michael, for some more examples.
Yeah, those are great. And to follow on to what Faith is saying, like the example of enrolling in 4 months versus a year, that's typically the type of estimates that we're able to put together now. The point that I want to make here is that the question was asking about this. It looks like it's the use of EHRs for research purposes. A point that I hope people can take away is that it is absolutely true to generate the initial patients at scale that you're looking for. But the reason it's successful to enroll them that way is because of the other things you've done to change the factory floor to allow those patients to come in. The things that Faith was talking about, the things I was talking about in terms of being able to have single contracts for sites and have a central PI, for example, a role that Faith plays. We have organizations where you can go look for patients quickly and find a large number of patients. Then the question is, what do you do from there? So changing the factory floor for me really means setting up the rest of the processes and using the technologies that you need to use to take advantage of that large number. And that type of 1 year down to 4 month enrollment is the result of that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. For our next question, they'd like to know, how do you address data rights when working with various sites and data partners in keeping with expectations of privacy?
Yeah, that's a major challenge, and a lot of innovation is still needed in this area. I think a lot of our learning, well, I guess all of our learning is through trial and error so far. I would say that there's a heterogeneous environment of concern about this. On the site side, it's very often related to healthcare, related to HIPAA concerns and things. On the sponsor side, it's related to the regulatory environment and privacy laws and regulations and things like that, obviously. And then when you put that together, there's a general concern about where is my data going and who's using it for what. So one of the things that we do, for example, is we've honed our messaging and our explanation of the data use and the data use agreement to explain exactly what's happening with the data and why. And so on the site side, another offering that I have to sites when I talk to them is that we're fully transparent. As I say, it's their data, but we're making use of it. And they're always allowed to ask, what are we doing? Where is it? What's going on with it? In general, there's a heightened concern around this area, and it varies tremendously from individual sites to large academic centers who may have a data privacy officer. So there's no easy way through it. You just have to go through it. It may be a number of conversations, both with legal and with data privacy folks, and then with the physicians at the site. The real key there is a good knowledge of privacy on the healthcare side and the regulatory side, understanding how, and then a firm knowledge of what's being done with that data and the willingness to discuss that with everyone and work through solutions.
It all could kind of follow on some thoughts from what Michael just said too. If physicians we're kind of raised in an environment that we are the custodian of our patients' medical records. And it's something that physicians take very seriously. And so that's something that in Elego, being an entity where we are partnering with healthcare, that's something that we're really well aware of. And if you think about the fact, medical records used to be at one time, their primary purpose was to facilitate communication between physicians for referrals, and also to document basically a cogent medical journey for their patients, so that that facilitated managing their patients' care. Now that has evolved with the advent of EHRs, so that a lot of it really has to do with facilitating third-party payments, driving reimbursement. And so one of the things that I've found in talking to physicians is, in some ways, I've heard them make reference to being, I've just turned into a giant data entry person, because I'm ultimately the one that is, the physician is the one who is signing off on, the lab, the clinical note, who's deciding what diagnosis code to enter in, that ultimately then becomes that data that folks like Michael are using to to query and to aggregate and curate. And so sometimes it's a little empowering for physicians to think, okay, that data that I'm involved in entering can now be used in a different way that brings a real benefit to my patients and to me, to be able to be involved in that research. So again, it's created a bridge between the data, the physician, and the patient, and the research trials. So that's just a little bit different way to think about it.
Very good, excellent. The next question we have for you asks, how are you able to support a study with such a variety of experience levels of investigators if you are recruiting patients at research experienced versus research naive sites?
Yeah, and that's kind of alluded a little bit to that earlier. The fact that we are started out as a company with primarily research naive investigators. We've developed an entire program for bringing them that capability to be able to support research and provide research within their clinical practice, and then have evolved to have the agility to adapt to whatever that particular site, that particular investigator needs. If they already have a robust research infrastructure, then it's a much more light touch that's needed. So again, we have just a lot that flexibility, that agility, because we have in place an infrastructure that can support an entirely research naive site at one end of the spectrum, and then we can take it all the way to the other end of the spectrum of a very, very light touch, so that we can support them in any way that they need or that they want.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much for that answer and for all of the answers today. However, we have reached the end of the Q&A portion of this webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Elego Research may follow up with you. Or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on your screen. Before we go, I want to remind the audience to take a look at the Handouts module within GoToWebinar, where you'll find additional material related to today's presentation for you to download and take home for some further reading. I want to also thank everyone for participating in the webinar today. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm also going to send you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view a recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers today, Faith Holmes and Michael Ibarra. We hope that you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.